It's a great privilege to be here, to be invited to give this distinguished speaker lecture at the Centre for Co-operative and Community-Based Economy at the University of Victoria. I was here 4 years ago, and it's wonderful to have the invitation to come back again. And I'm very happy to be following in the footsteps of the two previous speakers, distinguished speakers in this series, Marilyn Waring and Timothy Mitchell, both of whose work has been very inspirational for my own work. Well, so tonight my lecture will be based on this recently co-authored book, Take Back the Economy, an Ethical Guide for Transforming Our Communities. It's a book that's published by the University of Minnesota Press and came out in April of this year. And this book was written with my colleagues and ex-students, Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy, and it was planned and started in 2008 also with Julie Graham, my colleague for over 3 decades, who sadly died in 2010. So it's another J.K. Gibson Graham publication with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy. And I think this book is quite relevant to the work of a centre like this one that is interested in supporting the development of people and what we might call community-based or community-centred economies. So in this book, we're really extending the thinking that we put forward in our second book, A Post-Capitalist Politics, Julie and I, of who is our community, who is the community for which an economy works. And in the book, we're trying to extend this idea beyond just the human community, to take in the ways in which we can think about ourselves in more than human communities that occupy this planet. So Take Back the Economy is very much written as a popular book, and it was written with groups of people in mind, students and teachers, communities and congregations, unions and associations. So it's written to be read in a group, really, for reading and thinking and acting together. In a sense, it's designed to provoke ethical action for our times. So while it is informed, of course, by a range of social theories, including anti-essentialist political economy, theories of performativity, the new materialism or semiotics, material semiotics, and a mix of representational and non-representational strategies. But it's really written in a very accessible style, and the abstract theoretical language is avoided because we're trying to appeal to anybody who can read it without having to know those kind of theoretical traditions. And a colleague of mine's 12-year-old son started reading it, which I thought was quite good. So it doesn't lay down a blueprint, but it presents a series of what I'll call thinking practices, or techniques, or methods for enacting community economies. And so what I'd like to do in this lecture is to present some of these techniques and start with the technique of reframing, which is very central to this book, and then to move on to some of the simple tools that we've devised, I suppose, for reorienting ourselves to ethical actions for people and the planet. So first, the economy stupid. One of the premises of this book is that our current understanding of what constitutes an economy is standing in the way of responsibly facing the future and taking action to learn to live in our world in new ways. Ways that are less destructive of the very fabric of life as we've known it, particularly over the long interglacial summer. So this book is, to some extent, our response to starting to think about acting in a climate-changing world. The take-back of the book's title is, of course, a take-back that demobilises the prevalent idea that the economy is somehow a matter of fact, a matter indeed of very closed facts that adequately reflect reality and that operate together in known and predictable ways. This is the kind of machinic economy, usually called capitalism, which continues to be represented as the ultimate real, despite the guerrilla attacks by J.K. Gibson Graham for more than 16 years. And this is the wonderful Turkish edition of our book, The End of Capitalism, where they took a wonderful environmental poster and kind of modified it. And Julie and I there are the David and Goliath, the Davids, the joint Davids lobbing our stones in at the the Goliath of capitalism. Somehow they really got the idea of the book, you know, much more than Blackwell's publication in '96, which was a picture of Sisyphus rolling a stone up the hill, you know, ready. It was very published in a kind of black and red, very kind of German Marxist style. But anyway, hey, they published it, which was good. But Minnesota republished it 10 years later in a much more interesting way, I think. But I love the Turkish version. But just as an aside here, a question came to Anna Maria today from someone who couldn't be here tonight, who'd looked at the book, Take Back the Economy, and asked why the words feminism and gender weren't in the index of our new book. And I must say this observation came as a bit of a shock when I realised that it actually wasn't, those words weren't in the index. And I can only kind of explain this by saying that actually the whole book is imbued with a foundational feminist sensibility and couldn't have been written without years of feminist thinking and politics. And of course the very title, Take Back the Economy, is of course taken from the Take Back the Night idea, or, you know, struggles of feminists from long ago. And many people have said, well, how can you take back something when you never really had it? But I mean, you know, hey, women never had the night either, but you know, we still run, I think that title, Take Back, still has a useful force. So anyway, as I'll show, I think, as I go on, there is a lot of feminist sensibility in this book, but for some reason, it's not represented in the index. But anyway, back to the economy. It's now reasonably well accepted, I think, that the machinic vision of economy is built out of models of the economy that have become models for economic behaviour. Models moulded by metrics and technologies that perform national economies as large-scale economic experiments. And this is the monetary national income analogue computer built in 1949, which used water to model how money flowed through the UK economy and when government policy could and should intervene to stop off or enable flow. And there's a wonderful YouTube video of this guy trying. There's a few of these were built. One of them is at Cambridge, a few of them are around the world, and they still get rolled out every now and again and get shown how they work. And it's a very interesting YouTube to watch. But this kind of vision of the economy, which you know, was very prevalent and still to some extent is very prevalent, has been exposed, I think, by people like Michel Collin and Donald Mackenzie and, of course, Timothy Mitchell, who was here last year, as operationalising a kind of economic doctrine that was used all over the world to, in a sense, construct or perform national economies. So the work that's trying to show how economics is a performative kind of discourse could well be seen to kind of synchronise nicely with studies of biopower, the subject of governmentality studies. Biopower is, of course, that particular form of power exerted over and through the life of populations via things like health practices or sexual regulation, medical paradigms, education systems, and so on. And in the economic realm, according to some anyway, and many people I think in contemporary kind of political analysis, many people would argue that we are all governed by neoliberal capitalist biopower today. Certainly we are enrolled in the experimental apparatus of business as usual, whether it's in laboratories set up to test consumer behaviour and decision making under controlled settings, and in real world sites such as the current context in which models of the impact of new carbon taxes on different groups are being tested and tweaked against public opinion, and the calculative practices of energy providers and state governments. And of course in Australia, where we just had a federal election a few weeks ago, the new carbon tax is about to be abolished under the influence of various kind of pressures who are saying, you know, we're not ready for this kind of thing. But we are all involved in this kind of experimentation, and many people see it as a performance of capitalist biopower. In this kind of economy as machine imaginary, we're confined to a limited set of roles and set of motivations. And these are the familiar employee who somehow is motivated by wanting higher and higher wages, the business owner who wants more and more profits and lower costs, especially wages costs, the consumer who wants more stuff for less payout, the property owner who wants higher and higher returns from private property, than the investor who wants greater private returns from financial investment. So up against this kind of model of the economy, or this representation of capitalism, with its encompassing power, its generalisable dynamics and its enlarged spaces of agency, it's very hard to see around this. It's very hard to see how we can think of taking back the economy so that concern for well-being, that of ourselves, of others and earth others, is centre stage. And this, of course, is where the reframing as a technique of thinking and remaking the world comes in. To reframe is to change our understanding, to refocus on different things, and perhaps to foreground something that's been in the background. And for me, the most important reframing to have occurred, and perhaps one of the most powerful to have occurred in the last 100 years or so, has been one that's been brought about by the feminist movement. Feminism produced a very different discourse of what it is to be a woman. Feminism brought to light hidden histories, or her stories, of who holds up half the world. Feminism liberated women to take up many different roles, and it prompted a different way of thinking about the world, one that put care and life and interconnection centre stage. So in my work with Julie, the reframing offered by feminism has informed our thinking, our rethinking of the economy. The feminist message is a hopeful one. It takes a step beyond the old Marxist adage that we understand the world in order to change it. And it tells us that changing our understanding is to change the world, if only partially and locally. So when we represent the economy not as a machine-like entity, but as the outcome of everyday human actions, we're able to map out many ways that different kinds of ethical and responsible actions are emerging and can be strengthened. So in our book, Take Back the Economy, we challenge the identity of the economy as inevitably capitalist, and we take back the economy for people and the planet by focusing on the ethical decisions that inform multiple economic dynamics. Each chapter takes a mainstream economic term, such as work, business, markets, property and finance, and takes it back by reframing it as a space of ethical action or ethical decision making, reclaiming it for a community economy and not a capitalist economy. So I want to start by telling two different stories of women taking back the economy to illustrate what I mean by ethical action. The first is Sheena's story. In 2009, after 10 years in the advertising industry in New York City, Sheena Mathiakan decided to reboot her life and give something back to India, where she had been brought up. She decided to do this in a way that was creative and engaging, and that was based on transforming a very simple daily routine. She pledged to wear one dress, actually 7 copies of the same dress, the one that she's wearing there, every day of the year. A friend designed a reversible black cotton tunic modelled on one of her favourite dresses, and Sheena jazzed this little black dress up each day without buying anything new. Her challenge was to use only handmade or second-hand accessories gathered from thrift stores or donated as gifts, and the uniform project was born. For 365 days, Sheena posted a photo of her new outfit on the internet and donated $1 a day to the Ecological Foundation, a non-profit organisation providing educational opportunities for children from poor households in a country where 13 million children don't have access to education. Soon she gathered a legion of supporters and it attracted the attention of a somewhat alarmed fashion industry. By the end of the year, she had raised over $100,000 for the Ecological Foundation and helped over 300 children gain access to education. And she'd received donations of a bizarre range of accessories and been named Elle magazine's Women of the Year for 2009. A form of co-option, one could say. And she noted in her TED talk, there's a renewed sense of possibility here. Collectively, our individual actions can have macro impact. Everyday people can have real impact in the world. Well, the Uniform Project recognises that what we wear is an important aspect of our identity. It shapes how we feel about ourselves and how we are treated by others. The very human desire to look good, to feel both different and in, feeds an environmentally voracious form of economic growth, however. It's not hard to feel like a pawn in a huge conspiracy to get us to consume, discard, consume, discard. The volume of unworn clothes in the wardrobe speaks heaps for our fickleness and disregard for the environmental impact of our actions. A recent report showed that the average UK woman has 22 items of clothing in her cupboard that she'll never wear, and the average man only slightly less at 19. So Sheena's initiative shows another way forward. Using her flair and creativity, she's refashioning fashion and reframing what it means to be part of an economy. She's showing that we don't need to be blind consumers to contribute to the economy. By participating in economic activities such as recycling and reusing, we can reduce our ecological footprint and avoid feeding a fashion industry that exploits workers. And we can improve the lives of distant others through people-to-people economic connections, like the one she made through the Akanksha Foundation. The second story is a different kind of one. While Sheena is reducing her involvement with the global fashion industry and encouraging other people to do likewise through the ongoing Uniform Project, thousands of poor Indian women are increasing their engagement with it via the Sewa Trade Facilitation Centre, STFC. STFC was launched by the Self-Employed Women's Association, Sewa, an extraordinary union of self-employed informal sector workers in India that was set up in 1972. In India, 93% of the labour force works in the informal sector, in jobs that are unprotected by progressive labour laws. So there's very little opportunity for the vast majority of workers to share in the benefits of national economic growth, the growth of India that we hear so much about. Sewa reframes poor women as economic actors who can command respect from families, from peers, and most importantly from themselves, as well as police, city officials, politicians and policymakers. Sewa's membership of over 1.2 million across 7 states has taken their economic destiny into their own hands, organising hundreds of producer and marketing cooperatives and a cooperative bank and services such as health centres, childcare, a housing trust and training centres, and now, most recently, STFC, a not-for-profit craft business. The STFC is based in rural northern Gujarat, where conditions are harsh, where drought is frequent and families barely make a living from the land, having to regularly migrate from their villages to find food and work. And women here wear clothing that's beautifully embroidered in traditional designs. Even their bullocks sport colourfully embroidered covers. Today, Sewa, thanks to Sewa's reframing and organising activities, Gujarat women's embroidery adorns fashion garments worn in London, New York and Sydney, and 15,000 families in northern India are on the way to accessing a stable income. And while Gujarat women may think that black is an ugly colour to wear, they bow to the market advice that New York women won't wear anything else and incorporate this new so-called colour into their designs. As one woman says, now I'm able to earn a livelihood and support my family, not only with the bare necessities of life, like food, clothing and shelter, but I'm also able to educate my children, especially my daughter, who's today studying in the 2nd year of primary teacher certification. As they embroider cloth for an international fashion market, the artisans are assured that 65% of the proceeds of any sale will return to them via STFC, the company in which they are the suppliers, the managers and the shareholders. In their not-for-profit company, dividends can't be paid individually, but all surplus returns to the company to increase payments for the 15,000 artisan members and to expand the company's productive capacity. Both these stories of individual and collective acts, then, involve reframing as a prelude to claiming a space in the economy in a new way. Sheena reframes the faddish fashion industry as a place where a commitment to reduced consumption and increased people-to-people connection can be practiced. Sewa reframes poor women artisans as skilled producers and shareholders in a company with global reach, with market savvy and operational principles of social justice. Each is pursuing their own pathway towards building a better world. Sheena via developing more environmentally and socially just approaches to fashion, and Sewa via improving the life chances of the poorest of the poor. In so doing, Sheena and Sewa are taking back the economy as a space of ethical decision-making. And of course, these stories are not without their contradictions. One woman is advocating reduced consumption of new clothes, while thousands of other women in a very different location are banking on marketing their brand to well-heeled global consumers. And here I think we see in microcosm one of the biggest challenges of our contemporary times: how to take back the economy for people and the planet without resorting to a one-size-fits-all approach. Clearly, there are no simple answers. We must approach each effort to reclaim the economy for people and the planet with an open and a curious mind, a feeling heart, and an orientation towards the experimental rather than the programmatic. Let's not rush too quickly to the big picture and the critical judgments. So is there a way of approaching the challenges that face us so that we're not led into thinking that there's one true and better pathway forward? If the economy is not represented as a machine that operates in a predictable way, with economists pulling levers to control money supply or labour markets, then we can't set a course and expect that things will systematically unfold. And if our Earth is not a bottomless resource pit, we can't keep feeding it to a machine to be gobbled up and spewed out. We must find other metaphors, other frames of meaning that inspire new ways of being and acting. And this is where, for us, the diverse economy reframing comes in. It widens the scope of what makes up the economy, that is, the identity of the economy, and opens up the discussion of what economic dynamics we might want to activate. In our work with communities interested in different life-affirming development pathways, we've used this image of the iceberg economy to help people see that they are all contributing to an economy that meets material needs and distributes wealth and well-being. And this iceberg economy, this vision, we've used, as I said, in a lot of action research projects. But when I started doing more work in the Pacific recently around this kind of issue, the idea of an iceberg didn't seem that relevant, so we started using the idea of a floating coconut instead. And this is a wonderful image done by an artist in Solomon Islands of all the kind of different kinds of economies people were involved in there, where, as you can see, formal economic activities are very much a tip of the coconut, if you can call it that. The diverse economy then widens the scope of what makes up our economy, drawing on work in anthropology, in informal sector studies, in sociology, development studies, the cooperative movement, community activism. It gathers together a heterogeneous range of economic activities. So along with the mainstream economic activities of waged employment, formal markets and capitalist enterprise, it points to other forms of labour and transactions, enterprise, property forms and finance, including those in which relations are non-monetised and or are motivated by concerns that can't be reduced to rational competitive self-interest. So, for instance, if we move away from this tip, waged employment, formal market transactions and capitalist enterprise, we can see all the different kinds of alternative paid forms of labour that coexist with wage labour. And all, of course, the unpaid forms of labour that really make up so much of the value that creates our world and that supports life. We can look at all the different kinds of alternative markets in which transactions are governed by other kinds of connections, not just supply and demand. And we can look at all the non-market kind of transactions that are always in our society and are providing exchange relations or transactional relations with nature and with each other. In terms of enterprise, we can look at all the different kinds of enterprises, including capitalist enterprises, which are arranged around different kinds of norms or ethics, such as state-owned industry, socially responsible enterprises and non-profits. But also, as the work of the centre here is very interested in, all the kinds of non-capitalist enterprises, such as worker-owned cooperatives and community enterprise, along with, of course, sole proprietorship, which is probably the most prevalent form of enterprise around the world, and feudal and slave enterprise. When it comes to property, we can look at all the other forms of property, alternative private property, which is, again, governed by different kinds of relationships other than let's get the most return out of this private piece of land or information, intellectual property. And of course, all the forms of property that are open access, of which our relationships of access and care and so on are quite controversial at the moment. I'll come back to that in the future. And of course, when it comes to finance, we can look at all the alternative forms of finance and financial institutions that exist and coexist with mainstream finance, and all the non-market ways in which people invest and lend and donate to each other. Now, a diverse economy reframing, all we're doing here is a kind of gathering together the diverse forms of economic activities that coexist. This framing doesn't suggest that we can ignore the activities in this top cell of each of these columns, but it invites us to explore the complex interactions within diverse economies, and to experiment with different development pathways oriented directly to the growth of well-being, rather than only via only looking at development that occurs via the circuitous route of investment growth and trickle-down effects. So this diverse economy framework has been very helpful in looking at lots of different kinds of empirical situations. We can look at, for instance, the fashion industry, which I just talked about, in terms of all the different kinds of mainstream economic activities that are involved in the fashion industry, such as low-wage factory work, you know, the big department stores, big box stores, mail order, capitalist factories, trademark labels, designs of fashion houses, and bank finance for relocation of clothing factories to low-wage areas. But we can also look at the other kinds of activities that are part of a sector such as the fashion industry. All the self-employed fashion designers, the home-based piece workers, the thrift shops, the online sales by individuals, the flea markets, the organic cotton green clothing companies, or something like STFC, a not-for-profit embroidery clothing business. And the unpaid work that goes into clothing, the non-market transactions, and the non-capitalist enterprises that are involved in this sector. And again, when it comes to property, we can look at the kinds of alternative forms of private property, alternative market relations, and open access property relations, such as Sheena's online blog, in which she posts the designs and outfits and invites other people to use them, or non-market financial relations that are used to set up small businesses or revolving credit funds. So the diverse economy can be used for a different kind of sectoral analysis, but it can also be used in place to look at the diverse economic relationships that are existing in any one community. And for instance, the communities that I've worked in the Philippines, there's a whole language that goes along with the different kinds of diverse economic practices that people are involved in. And here's some examples of the kinds of names for different kinds of reciprocity or payments in kind that are in the ways in which people are working and work together. The different language for volunteer labour, for different kinds of work, and the different kinds of transactions that are, again, involved in people's livelihoods. The neighbourhood mortuary assistance, the community contributions to weddings, and so on. And I think many people think, oh, well, these kinds of diverse economic practices are much more prevalent in, countries like the Philippines, which are still, not totally developed in some senses. But the more you actually start to do this documentation work, the more you can see that many of these kind of practices exist in all countries, in minority world countries as well as diverse and as well as majority. It's a matter of opening your eyes up and starting to do the observations and the inventorying that's really needed to be done. But that's just one step, because the question still remains. How does a reframing of the economy in this kind of way, this way as the reframing to see economies as diverse, how does this help towards building different kinds of futures? In the capitalist growth machine, development is framed in terms of higher wages, more profits, cheaper goods, more private property, and unregulated gambling of our finances, as we've found out in the GFC. But we can take back our economy and work towards, or can we take back this and work towards a different kind of future? Well, in our book, we argue that we can start to build community economies shaped by negotiations around key ethical concerns. So we reframe these key areas of the economy in terms of what I will call ethical concerns, or the concerns of the community economy. So in terms of thinking about work or labour, we start to think about surviving well. What's necessary for human survival? Why do we work in the first place? How can we survive together with each other and earth others well and equitably? So let's think about the different ways in which we labour with this in mind. When it comes to business or enterprise, we start to think about, instead of how do we make more profits, what do we do with the extra or the surplus that is produced over and above what we need to survive? Enterprise is a place in which wealth is generated. How do we distribute this wealth or this surplus to enrich social and environmental health? When it comes to thinking about transactions, rather than thinking about markets and getting cheaper and cheaper goods, we start to think about what relationships do we have with other people and with the environments that help to satisfy our needs? How can we encounter others in ways that support their well-being as well as ours? So encountering others. When it comes to thinking about property, we start to think about what is it that we do to maintain and replenish the gifts of nature and intellect that all humans rely on? How can we care for our natural and cultural commons by commoning? And lastly, when it comes to thinking about finance, we really think about, well, what is investing? What is investing in a future? What do we invest our wealth in? How can we invest so that future generations live well? And across all those concerns, I think, is the overarching concern of consumption. What do we use and consume in the process of satisfying our needs? How can we consume more sustainably? So these are the kind of concerns, I suppose, or we've often called them coordinates, of a community economy. Unlike the structurally configured economy with its regularities and lawful relationships, the community economy is an acknowledged space of social interdependency and self-formation. Anything but a blueprint, it is an unmapped and uncertain terrain that calls forth exploratory conversation and political and ethical acts of decision. So, what I've done so far is just to outline then this idea of reframing, reframing the economy's identity as diverse, and reframing the idea of economic dynamics as involving enacting of ethical interactions. And I just want to go on to illustrate now some of the tools for ethical action that we develop in the book. So in it, we outline a series of tools, including inventories and metrics that can be used to enact community economies in which our interdependence with each other and earth others is openly acknowledged and ethically negotiated. So again, I want to talk about a few of those now. In each case, the first tool is that of an inventory of diversity, this open method of observation and naming which takes place outside of a capitalocentric frame. And the rest of the tools are ones that help us to identify and evaluate interdependence, our interdependence with each other and earth others. So I just want to illustrate the first with reference to the issue of survival and our working lives. So when we reframe labour and work in terms of a community economy concern, we focus on questions of surviving well together with each other and the earth. And we ask, how are we trading off our different survival needs, our own, those of others, and those of the earth? So the first step is just to do a very simple time use analysis of what kinds of work we do in the day and assemble what's done in terms of both hours and in terms of the kind of work, what kind of labour is done on a 24-hour clock. And this is a 24-hour clock of an Australian coal miner, a person who's dominated by waged work, doing a 12-hour shift for exorbitant rates of pay, the kind of monetary reward that buys allegiance to the fossil fuel industry. The kind of life that this leads to is one which research increasingly shows leads to ill health, to family breakdown, and mining town social dysfunction, especially with the 12-hour shifts and the bus-in or fly-in, fly-out mode of working, which is increasingly demanded by mining companies. A form of work, I think, that many people in the resource-based economy of Canada participate in. By contrast, here's then a 24-hour clock of a small farmer in the Philippines. And here, note the different kinds of work that are part of that 24-hour period, both paid work, unpaid work, farm work, paid in kind, recreation and rest. A mix of labour practices in his so-called livelihood portfolio, as a lot of the development practitioners like to call the livelihoods of people in the developing world, or so-called developing world. So, inventory. If we did this for ourselves, we'd probably find that most academics are a lot more like the 12-hour shift coal miner. And our work-life balance is much less than probably this guy's. We'll see. But what we can do then is to use this kind of a well-being index to start to balance, to look at what sort of well-being is created by that mix of survival strategies, that mix of labour. And again, research is showing that well-being is made up of at least 5 different kinds: material, occupational, social, community and physical. And many of us, particularly academics, I think, are foregoing physical, community and social. Probably we get quite a bit of occupational, and some of us get material well-being, but a lot of the other things are compromised. But these are the kind of scorecards one can start to use in a group to start to think about what kind of well-being is being created by this form of work, these different kinds of work that we're doing. What kinds of ways in which are we weighing up paid and unpaid labour time and time for life? So this is the kind of scorecard that we might come up with for our fictitious Danilo, a labourer in the Philippines, where it shows that he's not very well off materially, but his personal well-being is being supported by a rich community life and social support network. But then we ask, what about the ecological well-being of these kinds of lifestyles, these contrasting lifestyles? To look at our interdependence with Earth others, we can use the ecological footprint calculator to gauge how non-human surviving well is going in association with these working lives. And there's a lot of problems with these ecological footprint calculators, but they're quite interesting to do to try and assess what kind of carbon emissions go along with the kinds of lifestyles that different kinds of work patterns produce. We can calculate the different ecological footprints of these work styles and lifestyles and expand and contract the size of the circle representing the working day according to its ecological impact. So if we put the Australian coal miner next to the Philippines farmer and expand the coal miners to the size of the 3.5 planets that it would take if everybody lived the lifestyle of that person, versus the 0.7 planets that would be used up if everybody lived the same way as a Philippines farmer, we can start to see how different modes of surviving with their different ecological footprints are faring. We see, of course, that the Australian coal miner is drawing down the Earth's resources at an unsustainable rate, while the Philippines farmer is living within the planet's ecological means. Now, this is just a kind of a fictitious example, but we could do this for ourselves, this inventory, this exercise in sort of self-inventory and comparison. And if we were to do this and conduct it with groups of people as a prelude to starting to build different futures, we've got no idea in the sense where it would go. But we do know that doing it as a group would start a conversation around the kinds of ethics and ethical practices by which we want to live. We do know, of course, that there are a myriad of collective actions that we can point to in which groups are securing better livelihoods for themselves and others by agitating for living wages, basic incomes, recognition of care work, support for volunteers, communal service provision, reducing consumption, adopting more ecological sensitive lifestyles and so on. And there are many geographies of interconnection and responsibility that can be explored here. A language of the community economy marshals these kind of punctiform politics into a meshwork that has the potential to transform the world. A similar set of exercises then can be done with every aspect of the community economy. First, our method is to reframe, first differentiate the world, the economic world, and reframe it in terms of an inventory that allows us to look at the diversity of economic relations. Secondly, to reframe things in terms of ethical concerns, to become sensitive to the ethical interconnections that bring us into relation with each other and to our natural world. And third, we can look at these human-human interactions and human-non-human interactions alongside each other to explore our responsibility to each other, to future others and to earth others. And then we can start to identify and isolate the place of ethical decision and decide on the kind of actions that can be taken. Probably haven't got time to go into all the other forms of ethical interaction, but just very briefly, when we come to reframe market and non-market transactions as encounters with each other, with others, we can begin to identify our geographies of proximate and distant interconnection. We can inventory the kinds of goods and services that we acquire through transactions and classify them in terms of their diversity on a diverse economy dandelion, as we call it. So if you can see that, we could just start to look at our own cupboards and see where are the food items that we get, what countries do they come from, how far are they travelling. And then we could start to look at the different kinds of encounters that we are involved in, whether direct market encounters or indirect connections through formal markets, or direct connections through reciprocal transactions, gift transactions. And this is just a dandelion, a diverse economy dandelion of the simple tomato, this kind of tomato products that one might access. We can then use the kind of ethical interconnection checklist, the kinds of things that are very easily accessible now, to start to look at our consumption habits and how they affect others near and far, both in terms of the working conditions of people that produce goods and services that we consume, but also the environments in which they're made. And we can start to look at the well-being of those distant others and think about ways that we can support that well-being as well as our own. So developing this kind of sensitivity to a range of encounters that enrich our lives might lead to more direct connections of care between people and species. But of course there'll always be need for international trade, and we can start to do that in a more ethical way, just as it's being done now with fair trade networks and so on. Very briefly then, for property. When we start to think of property in terms of processes of commoning, again, we can start to look at our inventory of practice in relation to property. The time property geography is a kind of way of looking again through our lives in a 24-hour clock and looking at the kinds of movements that an individual might make according to the types of property that they come into contact with over a 24-hour period. And here, property is divided into individually owned private property, including individual, family and corporate property, collectively owned private property, state-owned property and open access property, both managed and unmanaged. And if we were to do this, we might be surprised to see that even in this case, the example of Bill and Sue, a miner and his wife, even though they live in a very privatised landscape of mines and a resource town, they actually make use and share various types of commons. A common for us is a property, practice or knowledge that's shared by our community. And our survival depends on many different kinds of commons, on biophysical, cultural, social and knowledge commons. Commons are continually made and remade. They're drawn down and replenished, maintained or degraded. But what happens to a commons depends on whether a community cares for it, shares it, sustains it, or whether it exploits or neglects it. So we've developed a kind of commons Identikit that helps us to make our commons visible and distinguish commons just from the idea of legal ownership. So to be a commons, we need to have access to property that's shared and wide, use of property that's negotiated by our community, benefit from property that's distributed to the community and possibly beyond, care of property that's performed by community members, and responsibility for property that's assumed by community members. We can use this kind of tool to identify where throughout our day, or for instance the Bill and Sue characters throughout their day, where they actually come into contact and make and share commons and community. And this is just an example of some of the places that they might not have recognised as part of their commons that they actually are involved in maintaining and sharing. The question of who owns a common is open. Commons can be created by any type of property. Private property that might be owned by an individual owner, a family, a corporation or a collective, state-owned property or open access property. In other words, ownership is largely a legal matter and doesn't deter land or other resources from being managed as a commons. And what we do in the book is we ask, how could we record our relationship to commons over a longer time period that places our present in the kind of temporal context that climate change asks us to consider? And to do this, we use this idea of a commons yardstick. Many of us can remember our grandparents and the stories that they told us about their life and that of their parents. So most of us can imagine back 3 generations. But can we try to imagine forward, not just 3 generations, but 7? And the 7 generations principle, of course, is something that's very core to many Indigenous people's vision of how to act in the world. So this commons yardstick takes that idea and so it starts to locate ourselves in terms of this generational time frame. So for instance, if we were to think about caring for an atmospheric commons, an atmosphere which up till now is still an open access form of property, we could start to look at the period in which we started to degrade the commons through the use of various kinds of fossil fuels, the times at which we noticed that the ozone layer was starting to be degraded, and the actions when it was taken to start to stop using the chemicals that were doing that. And the argument is it's going to take a few generations still for that ozone hole to actually heal. But when it comes to thinking about global warming, of course, we're very reluctant to start to see ourselves in this kind of frame, and yet that's the kind of ethical kind of discussion I think that we need to be involved in. This kind of framing starts to help us to see more clearly what kinds of ethical actions we need to take when it comes to making and sharing commons that ensure survival, and particularly survival of the planet. Just lastly then, when it comes to thinking about enterprise and business, doing an inventory of diverse forms of enterprise is important, to look at the different ways that value is generated and surplus is distributed. As we know from the diverse economy reframing, there's many different enterprise forms within which surplus is produced, appropriated and distributed in different ways. And this centre is particularly interested in this kind of diversity. So in the book we introduce the idea of the ethical audit of enterprise that allows us to identify the decision points where negotiation takes place around survival, about what kind of survival payment or wage is made to employees, and surplus, what is privately appropriated or put to maintaining certain kinds of ownership forms. And we use a kind of people's account to try and map out the different kinds of decisions that can be made, for example in a worker-owned cooperative, to produce a different kind of survival surplus account to start to put surplus not only into the community but also perhaps into relations beyond the enterprise and even into the environment or the environment at large. So I've rushed over a lot of the materials that are in the book just to give you a sense and a flavour of the ways in which we've tried to operationalise this idea of ethical interaction and interconnection. And our tools have borrowed from a lot of different kinds of techniques that have been developed in social science and in geography to help us start to think of different techniques of self-inventory and self-relationship to lead to different kinds of collective action. And the book gives a lot of examples of groups taking collective actions around these different kinds of relationships. So just to conclude, I'd like to consider just in ending then our role as academics in the making of community economies. And this quote from Bruno Latour is helpful, I think. He argues that under the guise of studying reality, academic disciplines are actually extending the range of entities at work in the world and actively participating in transforming some of them into faithful and stable intermediaries. And he continues with a pertinent example. He says, thus economists, for instance, are not simply describing some economic infrastructure which has always been there from the beginning of time. They're revealing calculative abilities in actors who didn't know before that they had them, and making sure that some of these new competencies are sunk into common sense through the many practical tools of bank accounts, property rights, cash register slips, and other plugins. And Latour asks scholars to be more aware of how we populate, multiply, stabilise, and discipline the world. Well, in our book, Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, we're attempting to, and here I'm paraphrasing Latour, to reveal the ethical abilities in actors who didn't know before that they had them, and making sure that some of these new competencies are sunk into common sense through a new set of practical tools. What we'd like to see is a new kind of common sense, such as a community economy's return on investment, in which we can think about a community economy return in terms of increased well-being, reduced ecological footprints, increased collectively controlled surplus, and increased ethical trade and expanded commons. And we see the investments in community economies as producing those. Our manual, or our pedagogy for building community economies, is, we hope, a contribution to enacting ethical community economies. Thanks.